The Neanderthals did not go extinct in a single moment. They were not wiped out by a war, or a plague, or a single climate disaster. What actually happened is far stranger, and we only finished mapping it last year. The last Neanderthals survived in places you can still visit, and one of them, we have just learned, was so alone he had been cut off from his own species for 50,000 years. For most of the 20th century, the story we told about the end of the Neanderthals was simple. They lived. We arrived. They lost. A clean handover, somewhere around 40,000 years ago. One species replaced by another, the way a tide replaces sand. But the science of the last decade has dismantled that story almost completely. The new picture is slower, sadder, and far more interesting. The Neanderthals did not disappear in a battle. They were not erased by a single climate event. They contracted. They were funneled, generation by generation, into a shrinking archipelago of refugees along the southern edge of Europe. And in those refuges, these specific caves, these named valleys, these particular coastlines, the last members of a separate branch of humanity lived out the final centuries of their species. This is the atlas of that disappearance. Over the next hour, we will travel to the places where the last Neanderthals are known to have survived. We will stand on the cliff at Gibraltar, where a fire burned in a cave called Gorham as late as 28,000 years ago. We will walk into Mandrin in southern France, where a single tooth, sequenced in 2024, revealed a Neanderthal so genetically isolated his lineage had been alone for 50,000 years. We will follow the radiocarbon dates as they thin and scatter across Iberia, Italy, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and by the end, to understand where the last Neanderthals survived human prehistory, you have to understand the world they came from, the precise geography Europe of how 60,000 years ago. Because the strange truth we know today is barely recognizable to us. Vast portions of the north are buried under ice. Something quieter happened. The British Isles are not the places where it happened. They are a peninsula attached to the European mainland by a low, fertile plain that geologists now call Doggerland. The Mediterranean is colder. Sea levels are around 80 meters lower than today, which means that what is now seabed off the coasts of Spain, Italy, and Greece is instead dry land. Coastal plains stretch for kilometers beyond the modern shoreline. Rivers cut deep gorges through landscapes we will never see again. This is the maximum extent of the Neanderthal world. Their range stretches from the Atlantic coast of Portugal in the west to the Altai mountains of southern Siberia in the east, from Wales in the north to the Levant in the south. They have lived on this land for nearly 400,000 years. They are not, as we once imagined, a brutish offshoot of humanity. They are humans, different humans. Their brains, on average, are slightly larger than ours. Their bodies are stockier, more powerfully built, adapted over hundreds of millennia to the cold pulses of the Pleistocene. They use fire. They cook food. They make complex tools. They bury their dead, sometimes with what look like grave goods. They paint, occasionally, in red ochre on cave walls in Spain that predate the arrival of our species in Europe by tens of thousands of years. They care for the sick and the wounded. The skeleton of an old man found at Shanidar in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan has a withered arm, a crushed eye socket, and severe arthritis, and he lived with all of those injuries into late middle age. Someone, almost certainly several someones, kept him alive. This is the species, This is the world, and this world is already, slowly, beginning to close. Around 60,000 years ago, the climate of Europe enters one of its most volatile periods in the last 100,000 years. Glacial pulses come in faster cycles. Forests advance and retreat over single human lifetimes. Dry steppe that supports the great herds, the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant deer, expands and contracts unpredictably. Neanderthal populations have always lived at low densities. Now those densities begin to thin further. Genetic studies of late Neanderthal remains show repeated bottlenecks, generations in which entire groups have been reduced to small inbred bands. You can see this in the bones. The skeletons from El Cedron in northern Spain. The arrival is not the dramatic family group of 13 Neanderthals who died together. It does not happen 1,000 years ago or 1 year. Show extreme inbreeding. Modern humans, among them are individuals with rare congenital deformities, had already reached the spine tens of thousands of years earlier. They were not unhealthy because of poor diets with Neanderthal constitutions. Before retreating. They were unhealthy because there around 45,000 years ago, a wave moves into Europe. Around 45,000 years ago, for a long time, to this archaeologists believed there was something arrives in the sediment. A layer of Neanderthal tools at the bottom, the Mysterian, and a layer of modern human tools above, the Aurignacian, a handoff frozen in stone. Then in 2022, a team led by the French archaeologist Ludovic Slimak published what he had been finding for years in a cave called Grotte Mandrin in the Rhone Valley of southern France. The Mandrin sequence is extraordinary. Layer by layer, season by season, the cave preserves a record of who lived there. And the layers do not show a clean handover. They show alternation, a layer of Neanderthal occupation, a thin layer of distinctly modern human stone tools, dated to about 54,000 years ago, far earlier than anyone thought sapiens had reached Western Europe. Above that, more Neanderthals, then sapiens again, then Neanderthals. For roughly 10,000 years, the cave traded hands, sometimes within a single generation. The two species, and at this point we should pause and say it carefully, because the word species is doing a lot of work, were sharing a landscape and possibly even a structure in a way no one had imagined. What did those encounters look like? We will probably never know. There are no signs of violence in the Mandrin layers. There are no signs of trade either. In the genomes of the few late sapien skeletons we have managed to sequence is Neanderthal DNA. Always Neanderthal DNA. Sometimes a great deal of it. The famous skeleton from Oase Cave in Romania, dated to around 40,000 years ago, had a Neanderthal great-great-grandfather. Just 4 or 5 generations earlier, in his direct lineage, was a Neanderthal man. Whatever happened at the contact zone, it was not, on the whole, war. It was something more complicated. And whatever it was not enough to save them. Because at the same time that Mandrin is recording its alternating layers, something else is happening across Europe. The radiocarbon dates of Neanderthal sites. The first parts of the Neanderthal world, they stop appearing in clusters. The north. First in Look at a map Europe, of dated Neanderthal sites. Then in the east. Between 45 the map and 40,000 years ago. Still living. In that period, by generation, the points scattered across what is now Belgium, the Netherlands, and on that shrinking map, Northern Germany, and Poland begin to thin out. For reasons we are only now beginning to understand. They vanish. Hold on. The cave at Spy in Belgium, where Neanderthal bones were first scientifically described in 1886, has its last Neanderthal layer around 40,000 years ago. Goyet, also in Belgium, around the same time. The Neander Valley itself, the small German gorge that gave the species its name, has not yielded a Neanderthal date younger than that. There is a reason the North falls first. Around 40,000 years ago, the Earth experiences what climate scientists call Heinrich Event Four, vast armadas of icebergs calving from the ice sheets that still cap northern Europe pour into the North Atlantic. The cold fresh water disrupts the ocean currents that carry warmth up from the tropics. Across northwestern Europe, average annual temperatures drop sharply. Forests retreat. The mosaic of woodland and open ground that has supported Neanderthal hunters for tens of thousands of years simplifies into harsh, dry steppe. Around the same time, the Phlegraean Fields, a volcanic system in the Bay of Naples, erupts. The blast, known as the Campanian Ignimbrite, is the largest volcanic event in Europe in the last 200,000 years. It deposits a layer of ash that has been found from the Russian plain to the western Mediterranean. The eruption itself does not on its own end the Neanderthals, but its ash layer falls across landscapes where Neanderthal populations were already thinning. In some regions, archaeologists find Mysterian tools below the ash, and Aurignacian tools, modern human tools, above it, as if the eruption marked, in some places, a final boundary. This is what disappearance looks like in the data. It is rarely a single, sharp end. It is the slow stoppage of a clock. The youngest Neanderthal date in Belgium becomes the youngest Neanderthal date there forever. The next younger date is now further south. And the year after that, further south still. By 38,000 years ago, the entire northern half of Europe is, for our purposes, empty. There are no living Neanderthals north of the Pyrenees and the Alps that we have yet been able to find. The species is now, for the first time in its long history, restricted to the southern peninsulas, Iberia, Italy, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and smaller pockets in between. You will hear sometimes that the Neanderthals could not adapt to the cold of the last ice age, that they were, in the end, undone by climate. This is almost the opposite of the truth. The Neanderthals were the cold specialists of Europe. Their bodies, their firecraft, their hunting strategies, all of it was tuned for cold. What the late Pleistocene threw at them was not simple cold. It was instability, cycles of warming and cooling so rapid that no group of large-bodied predators could fully adjust, combined, very probably, with the new pressure of another similar predator now sharing their land. They had survived ice ages before. This time, they were not surviving them alone. So they retreated, or rather, the species was thinned, region by region, until what remained. There is an old debate in Neanderthal studies, and the largest, it is called the Ebro Frontier hypothesis, was a place that a Neanderthal, the Ebro, 60,000 is a river that runs across never have walked to without from the Cantabrian Mountains felt to the Mediterranean, like the world. For most of human history, it has been a quiet feature of the Iberian landscape, peninsular shelter. But in the late 1990s, an archaeologist named João Zilhão proposed something striking about it. Looking at the radiocarbon dates of late Neanderthal sites and early modern human sites in Iberia, he noticed a pattern. Above the Ebro, modern human sites began appearing relatively early, by perhaps 42,000 years ago. Below the Ebro, in the southern half of the peninsula, Neanderthal sites continued for thousands of years longer. The river, or rather the harsh dry country around it, seemed to be acting as a barrier, a frontier. North of it, sapiens. South of it, Neanderthals. For a long, strange interval. The Ebro Frontier hypothesis is contested. Some of the dates have been revised. Some sites that once seemed to be late Neanderthal have turned out, on closer inspection, to be older than they appeared. But the basic shape of the picture has, broadly, survived. Iberia held on longer than almost anywhere else. You can see why if you walk the country. Even today, the Iberian Peninsula is a place of microclimates. The high plateaus of the interior, the wet green strip along the Atlantic coast, the dry Mediterranean south, the deep limestone gorges where rivers cut through the karst. For a small population predator, hunting large game, this is excellent country. There are valleys here that, even in the worst pulses of the last ice age, kept their water, their browse, their wildlife, pockets of habitable land that did not collapse the way the open plains of Central Europe did. In one of those pockets, the cave called El Salt, near Alcoy in eastern Spain, archaeologists have spent decades excavating one of the most carefully studied Neanderthal sites in the world. The deposit is enormous. It records in its layers thousands of years of Neanderthal life, hearths, stone tools, the bones of hunted ibex and red deer, the careful, repeated use of the same fire spots across generations, and then abruptly, the Neanderthal layers stop. In El Salt, the last Neanderthal hearths burned around 45,000 years ago. After that, the cave is empty for a long stretch. When humans return, they are modern humans. The cave does not record the moment of the changeover. It records instead an absence. If you want to stand where the last Neanderthals are believed to have stood, you have to go farther to the southern tip in places like Gorham's Cave. On the cliffs, you take a road out of the small town of La Linea for a long time, cross a border for longer, and find yourself on anywhere else on Earth that juts into the Mediterranean, like the prow of a ship. The Rock of Gibraltar, 6 kilometers long, limestone, riddled with caves. On the eastern side of the rock, where the cliffs fall almost vertically into the sea, there is a cave. Its mouth opens roughly 30 meters above the water. From inside, looking out, you see only sea and sky. On a clear day, the coast of Africa is visible across the strait, 15 kilometers south. The cave is called Gorham's Cave. It was first explored in any systematic way in the 1940s. And what archaeologists have found there has, slowly and stubbornly, redrawn the timeline of Neanderthal extinction. The deposits inside Gorham's Cave are deep. The lowest archaeological layers contain Mysterian stone tools, the kind of tools the Neanderthals had been making in essentially the same shapes for hundreds of thousands of years. There are hearths, charred bones of seals, of dolphins, of seabirds. Some of the earliest direct evidence anywhere in the world that Neanderthals were systematically exploiting marine resources, combing the tide line, diving for shellfish perhaps, hunting young seals on rocky shores. The Neanderthals at Gorham were not, as they are sometimes still imagined, primitive cousins clinging to a single hunting style. They were ingenious. They lived in a place of extraordinary ecological richness, a coastal microclimate sheltered by the rock, with the sea at their door and a mosaic of inland habitats just behind them. They ate what the place gave them, and the place gave them a great deal. In 2014, a research team led by the British archaeologist Clive Finlayson reported something inside the cave that quietly changed the conversation about Neanderthal cognition. Scratched into the bedrock, deep inside one chamber, was a deliberate pattern. 8 straight, parallel lines, intersected at right angles by two more lines and a long diagonal stroke through the center. The pattern had been engraved into a hard layer of dolomite that lies directly beneath an undisturbed Mousterian level, which means, if the dating is correct, that whoever made the engraving did so before the layer above was deposited, before sapiens were anywhere in the area, by a Neanderthal hand, more than 39,000 years ago. It is not a painting of an animal. It is not, by any reading, language, but it is a deliberate, abstract mark, a pattern made for the sake of making a pattern, the kind of thing every textbook until recently said only modern humans did. And the dates of the Neanderthal occupation at Gorham's Cave keep getting younger. The most controversial dates, and they are still debated, push the last Mousterian layers down toward 32,000 years ago. Some specialists place them earlier, around 36,000. Others have argued for figures younger still, in the high 20s of thousands. The debate is technical and ongoing, but almost no one disputes that the Neanderthals at Gorham survived for several thousand years after the species had vanished from most of Europe. Stand at the mouth of that cave today. Look out at the strait. There were people here, watching the same horizon. 4,000 years after the last Neanderthal had died in France or Germany. They had fire. They had children. They had, in a meaningful sense, art, and they were the last of their kind. The fire eventually went out at Gorham too. But before we leave Gibraltar, we have the cave is called Grota back Mandrin. To the cave in the Rhone Valley. It opens onto the Rhone where Valley, this story really small town of Malatavera. Because in 2024, a single ancient genome, briefly, the genome of a Neanderthal man, known to his discoverers only as Thorin, but Mandrin, forced everyone working on the end of the Neanderthals around 2050 to redraw their picture led by Ludwig Slimak, found in one of the late Neanderthal layers a partial skeleton. They named the individual Thorin, after the dwarf king from Tolkien, partly because of the cave's narrow mountain passage feel, partly as a quiet acknowledgement that this might be the last of his line. Thorin lived around 42,000 years ago, possibly a little later. He was an adult man, somewhere in his 30s or 40s when he died. His teeth show the wear pattern of a life eaten with stone tools. His bones are robust. Anatomically, he is unmistakably Neanderthal. There is nothing visually surprising about him. Then his DNA was sequenced. The result, published in the journal Cell Genomics in 2024, was the kind of finding that makes a room full of paleogeneticists go very quiet. Thorin's genome did not look like any other late Neanderthal genome on record. It did not cluster in the family tree of the species with the late Neanderthals from Vanishing Cave in Croatia, or from the Caucasus, or from Spain. It branched off instead, much, much earlier, roughly 105,000 years ago. What this means in plain language is this. The lineage Thorin belonged to had been genetically isolated from all other known late Neanderthals for the entire span of what archaeologists call the late Pleistocene, 50,000 years, 2,000 human generations. His ancestors and the ancestors of every other late Neanderthal we have sequenced had not exchanged genes for that entire period. They lived in a Europe small enough that you could walk from his cave to Vindaja in a few months. And yet, biologically, his people had been alone for longer than agriculture has existed. How is that possible? The team's interpretation is something like this. Thorin's lineage was probably a small population, perhaps numbering only in the tens or low hundreds, holed up in a particular pocket of southern France. They were so isolated for so long that they had become almost a distinct people within their own species. They did not mate with neighboring Neanderthal groups. They did not, evidently, even encounter them in numbers high enough to leave a genetic trace. They were, in a sense, a ghost branch of humanity, hiding inside the better-known Neanderthal world. This changes how we should think about the end of the species. The map of late Neanderthal populations is not the relatively connected network it was once imagined to be. It looks instead like an archipelago, islands of small, inbred groups, separated from each other by social or geographical barriers we can no longer see, each one a refuge in itself, each one carrying a slightly different fragment of the genetic story. When you imagine, then, the end of the Neanderthals, you should not picture a single coherent population dwindling from large to medium to small. You should picture this archipelago losing islands one by one. A small group in northern Belgium goes silent. The point on the map vanishes. A small group in central Germany goes silent. The point on the map vanishes. The Italian groups thin out. The Balkan groups thin out. By the time you reach Thorin's death in his cave above the Rhone, the archipelago has fragmented into a handful of remaining points. He is not, biologically, related to most of them. He is the last visible inhabitant of his particular island, and there is a poignant detail in the data. Thorin's genome shows what geneticists call signs of recent inbreeding. His ancestors in his last few generations had been forced to mate with close relatives. There were not enough of them left. He died, fed and intact, in a cave he probably knew, the way you know a childhood home. The fires he had sat by went cold, and the people who had carried, alone, Italy held on family history of one branch of Italian cave, Europe, a tooth carried it no further. Everybody thought the Thorin discovery Neanderthal does not, by itself, 80 years, tell us why the Neanderthals ended to be ours. But it tells us the Italian painful clarity has the same what the ending looked like as Iberia. Inside. It is a long, mountainous tongue of land, jutting into the Mediterranean. A growing silence on the map. It has microclimates. So where else it has on that thinning rugged country did the last Neanderthals small populations of large game hunters can use? And it sits on a corner of Europe where, even during the worst pulses of the Pleistocene, the climate is moderated by the surrounding sea. In the south of Italy, in the region called Apulia, the heel of the boot, there is a cluster of caves where late Neanderthal occupations have been carefully dated. The cave called Roccia San Sebastiano, near Mondragone, has Mousterian layers that reach into the high 30s of thousands of years ago. The famous site of Castelcivita in Campania preserves a sequence in which the latest Neanderthal layers are sealed by, and partly contemporary with, the Campanian ignimbrite ash, the volcanic event we met earlier. Some of the latest Neanderthal industries on the peninsula are found just below or within that ash. There is also Sicily. Archaeologists were skeptical that Neanderthals had ever crossed onto Sicily at all. The Strait of Messina, even at its narrowest during low sea levels, would have required a short sea crossing, and the Neanderthals, conventional wisdom held, were not seafarers. But more recent surveys of Sicilian caves have produced Mousterian tools that argue, at the very least, for occasional Neanderthal presence on the island. The picture is debated. Some specialists see clear evidence of seasonal occupation. Others see only thin traces. But the possibility is there. The southernmost Neanderthals in Europe may not have lived on the European mainland at all. The Italian dates, like the Iberian dates, push uncomfortably late. Around 38,000 years ago, the great changeover begins. Mousterian layers, Neanderthal layers, start to be replaced by Aurignacian layers, the signature of modern humans. But the changeover is not instant, and it is not even. In some valleys, the Neanderthals seem to have held on for centuries longer than their cousins 100 kilometers away. The map fragments further. A particularly striking site is in the deep south of Italy. At Grotta del Cavallo, in Apulia, 2 infant teeth, recovered decades ago and long classified as Neanderthal, were re-examined in 2011 and re-identified as belonging to anatomically modern humans. The teeth are dated to between 45 and 43,000 years ago, which means that some of the earliest known modern humans in Europe were already living on the Italian heel, at the same time that just to the north, Neanderthals were still occupying their caves. The two were neighbors for a long time, across a kind of moving frontier that, on the human timescale, must have felt static. Generations of people on each side, occasionally meeting, occasionally not. By 35,000 years ago, the Caucasus Mountains, where Europe runs out of itself between the Black Sea, the Neanderthal sites, and the Caspian, are essentially gone. We're one of the great Neanderthal heartlands. Italian Refuge has lost its cave of Mesmaiskaya, but by then, in the western Caucasus of southern Russia, has already entered, has yielded some of the most important Neanderthals ever found. Jumps thousands of kilometers, a nearly complete skeleton of a newborn. Skeletons of older individuals. Some of the earliest Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA ever sequenced came from these bones. And the cave preserves a long sequence of Mousterian layers that records, like a slow ledger, the fate of Neanderthals on the eastern edge of their world. The latest Neanderthal layers at Mesmaiskaya date to around 40,000 years ago, but traces of late Mousterian occupation persist in caves across the wider Caucasus region for thousands of years longer. The picture is one of small bands working a difficult mountainous terrain, a cold refuge, but a refuge nonetheless. Sapiens populations took longer to establish themselves in the Caucasus than they did in Central Europe. There was time here for the old residents to keep going. Then there is Crimea, the peninsula that hangs from the Black Sea coast, more island than mainland, has Mousterian sites that some researchers argue date to as late as 36 or 35,000 years ago. The cave of Burankaya III has been one of the most discussed. The dates have been contested. Some have been redrawn. But once again, the broad pattern survives. Crimea, like Iberia, was a peninsular refuge, a finger of land where the climate was less harsh, the prey more reliable, and the contact with incoming sapiens populations slower than in the open lands to the north. Even further east in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, the famous Denisova cave preserves an even more layered story. Neanderthals lived in Denisova at various points across more than 100,000 years. Their sister species, the Denisovans, lived there too. And in 2018, a single bone fragment from the cave was identified as belonging to a teenage girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan, a first-generation hybrid, not a distant ancestor of the Denisovans or the Neanderthals, a person alive in the cave with a Neanderthal mother in the next chamber over and a Denisovan father somewhere across the valley. Think about that for a moment. Two species of human, separated for hundreds of thousands of years, meeting in a single Siberian cave and producing a child whose bone, 90,000 years later, would tell us everything. The late Pleistocene was not a clean tree of human descent. It was a braided river. People crossed between branches, quietly, all the time. The Denisova Neanderthals do not seem to have lasted as late as the Iberian or Italian ones. By the time the last fires were burning at Gorham, the Neanderthals of the Altai had probably been gone for some millennia. But Denisova reminds us how complicated the late Pleistocene human world really was. There were not two kinds of humans in the Old World. There were at least three, possibly more, with regions where they overlapped, interbred, and then one by one vanished. So the geography of the last Neanderthals comes into focus. A vast Central Europe gone first. Then a constellation of southern refugees, each holding on for centuries or millennia after the heartlands have emptied. Iberia, especially the south. Italy, especially the heel. The Caucasus, look at the places Crimea. Again. And inside
Iberia,
even those refugees, smaller pockets, like Thorin's lineage, that had been
Crimea,
alone with themselves for far longer than anyone realized.
Thorin lived.
Now, they are not random. We have a map. Almost every late Neanderthal refugees is the most interesting one of all. They are peninsular. Why these places? Or mountainous. And why? They are far from the open plains. Were they not enough? Suffered most when the climate swung. They have varied terrain, with rivers, cliffs, valleys, and coast, all within short walking distance. They are warmed in a deep way by the Mediterranean or the moderating effect of nearby seas. And they are at the periphery, at the edges of the continent, away from the broad central pathways along which incoming sapiens populations seem to have moved. Climatologists who model the late Pleistocene call places like these climate refugia. The term comes from biology, where it describes the small pockets of suitable habitat in which a species can survive a period of regional collapse. When the broader landscape changes too quickly, populations that happen to be living in refugia can hold on. Sometimes they emerge again when conditions improve and recolonize the wider land. Sometimes they do not. The forests of southern Europe served as climate refugia for many tree species across the Pleistocene. The pollen record shows oaks and beeches and ashes hiding out in southern peninsulas during ice ages, then expanding north when the warmth returned. The Neanderthals, in this sense, were behaving exactly like a species under pressure should behave. They were retreating, at landscape scale, into the patches of land where the climate of the last glacial cycle bit least hard. They were not running away from us, in the dramatic sense the old story suggested. They were doing what oaks and bears and red deer also did, pulling back to the south, holding on. In other circumstances, this would have worked. They had been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. They had survived ice ages before. Each time the climate worsened, populations had thinned and concentrated in the southern refugia. Each time it improved, populations had spread back into the recovering north. The whole rhythm of Neanderthal evolution, in some readings, is an oscillation between expansion and contraction across this same landscape. So what was different this time? There are several answers, and they are probably all partly true at once. The first is that the climate of the last ice age was unusually unstable. The cycles came faster. The pulses were more violent. The Heinrich Event stacked up. The Campanian ignimbrite added a wild card. Even a species superbly adapted to cold can be undone by chaos. The second is sapiens. We have been careful in this video not to cast modern humans as villains. the data does not, in general, support a narrative of conquest. There are no battle sites. There is little evidence of direct violence, but sapiens were simply more numerous. They lived at higher densities, possibly because of subtle differences in how they organized themselves, hunted, stored food, exchanged goods over long distances. Where Neanderthal bands were small and scattered, modern human bands were apparently better networked. Across thousands of years, that difference is enormous. A Neanderthal refuge holding 200 people could be slowly enclosed, encircled, perhaps absorbed by a sapiens population that, in the same area, was growing into the thousands. The third is the math of small populations. We saw it in El Cedron. We saw it in Thorin's genome. By the time the species was confined to its southern refugia, many of those populations were already small enough to be vulnerable. Inbreeding accumulated. Each generation, slightly more of the genetic load that comes with limited mate choice. Each generation, slightly less resilience to a bad year. Once a small population dips below a certain threshold, it cannot recover from even a moderate setback. A bad winter, a disease, a poor hunting season. 2 or 3 of those in a row, and the group is gone. The Neanderthals and their refugia were caught in a slow squeeze. The land was holding them. But the land could only hold so much, and the world they had survived for nearly 400,000 years was no longer the same world. There is one place where the Neanderthals are still alive, years ago, and you carry perhaps a little earlier, around the last fires of which we have international record have gone paleogeneticists led the by cave at Gorham Cave is silent. Published the first draft. The valley around Mandrin holds no Neanderthal population on its own. The Caucasus scientific landmark have emptied. The result was the great map of Neanderthal Europe, as a byproduct that for so long the discovery stretched from the Atlantic every living human being outside of sub-Saharan Africa dark carries Neanderthal DNA until you look at your own DNA. Somewhere, on average, between 1 and 2.5% of the human genome of a modern European, East Asian, or Indigenous American is, by direct inheritance, Neanderthal in origin. What that 2% does is still being unraveled. Some of it appears to be functionally neutral. Some of it is involved in the immune system, in the way the body responds to viruses and bacteria. A sensible inheritance, given that Neanderthals had been adapting to Eurasian pathogens for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors arrived. Some of it is involved in skin and hair. Some of it is involved in the way the body handles fat, sugar, sleep, light. There are Neanderthal-derived gene variants that affect the risk of certain modern diseases, and others that affect protection against them. The numbers vary by region. People of East Asian ancestry tend to carry slightly more Neanderthal DNA than Europeans on average. People of Melanesian ancestry carry not just Neanderthal DNA, but Denisovan DNA as well, sometimes up to 4 or 5% of their genome. The picture is not uniform. It is instead a record of a long, complicated, repeated set of encounters between species that did not see themselves as separate species and did not need to in order to leave a genetic trace. What this means, when you think about it carefully, is that the Neanderthals did not exactly go extinct. Not in the strict biological sense, anyway. A species goes extinct when its lineage is broken, when no part of its genetic line continues forward in time. The Neanderthal lineage is broken in the sense that there are no longer any populations of pure Neanderthals walking the earth, but fragments of their genome, entire genes, sometimes 100,000 letter stretches of DNA, are alive in your body. in the bodies of nearly everyone you know, in the bodies of around 6 billion people now living. The Neanderthals did not lose. Not in the simple sense the old textbooks taught. They were absorbed through interbreeding events that may have been frequent, casual, ordinary, through the meeting of small bands at watering holes, at fire spots, in the long shadow of a passing season, through the children of those meetings who carried their Neanderthal mothers and fathers forward into the next species. This is the strange dignity of how their story actually ended. The map of Refugia goes dark. The fires at Gorham and Mandrin and Mesmiskaya go cold. And at the same time, in a different part of the same continent, the genes those fires kept alive are being carried into a population that will not lose them. Will not, in fact, be able to lose them. 2% of a person, multiplied by every person, becomes a kind of vast, distributed inheritance. The Neanderthals are gone in the way a river is gone when it joins a larger river. They have not disappeared. They have merged. Whether you find this comforting or melancholy is a question that says more about you than about the science. Both readings are legitimate. Happens when you stand as a coherent thing cave, ended and look out. The genes did not. The wind off the strait. The question of whether a species is the Mediterranean is a flat, its hard blue, is a question philosophers you can see have not yet finished arguing about. Behind the map of last limestone of the rock rises 300 meters straight up. The map of where we got pieces. The cave is wide and tall. It smells of salt and old stone. There is a small wooden walkway now, and a sign explaining what was found here, and the polite hush of any modern archaeological site. It does not feel like a place where a species ended. It feels like a place where someone might still build a fire. That is, perhaps, the point. The Neanderthals did not vanish from a battlefield or an empty plain. They vanished from places that look today like places people might still want to live. From sea cliffs with a view, from a cave above a river, from the warm, sheltered country of southern Europe. The geography of their disappearance is the geography of the European holiday. We tend to think of extinction as something that happens far away, in landscapes that are themselves alien to us. The end of the Neanderthals happened almost everywhere we like to go on vacation. That should change something about how we think about them. Not because it makes their ending more tragic, but because it places them, finally, where they always were. Not as a remote evolutionary curiosity, not as a brutish prelude to the human story, but as another kind of human, living in the same valleys, watching the same horizons, raising children in the same caves we now keep trying to find. The work of mapping their last refuges is not finished. New sites are being excavated every year in Spain, in Italy, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus. New ancient genomes are being sequenced from teeth and bones recovered decades ago and never previously sampled. The picture we have of where the last Neanderthals survived in 2026 is significantly more detailed than the one we had 10 years ago. The picture in another 10 years will be more detailed still. There may be refugia we have not yet identified. There may be lineages like Thorin's that we have not yet noticed inside the populations we have already studied. The story is still being recovered, but the broad shape of it now seems clear. Not a sudden end, not a single extinction, a long retreat into the southern peninsulas, a scatter of small, isolated bands holding on for centuries longer than anyone once thought possible. A single ghost lineage in the Rhone Valley, alone with itself for 50,000 years. a final fire on a sea cliff at the southern tip of Europe, and, threaded through all of it, the slow merging of a sister species into the population that survived. If you remember nothing else from this hour, remember this. The next time you stand at the edge of an old cliff in southern Europe and watch the sea move and feel the strange depth of the place, there were people there before you. People who were not your direct ancestors, but who were, in a real and verifiable sense, your relatives. They sat where you sit. They watched what you watch. They are gone in one way and present in another. And the map of where they made their last stand is also, in the end, a map of where they decided, in the way no species really decides, to wait. There is a question worth leaving you with. If something close to 2% of you came from a population that no longer exists in pure form anywhere on Earth, a population whose last members watch the same sea you might watch this summer, does that make them extinct, or does it make them ancestors? Sit with that one. Tell us what you think. The answer changes how you read the rest of your own genome. Thank you for spending this time with the deep past. The next chapter in our exploration of the human story takes us further back still, to the moment, more than 2 million years ago, when our ancestors first stepped down from the trees and out into the open. We will see you there.